Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Rowe.
And I'm Nique.
And welcome to The Invisible Men, where we make the achievements of incredible men invisible no more. Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute.
I'm Nique, a member of the Leadership Network at AEI.
Hello, Nique. Great to see you.
Hello, my brother. Great seeing you.
Yeah. And as our viewers know, we're always interviewing some fascinating, primarily Black men who are doing things that aren't widely known. And about a year ago in the Wall Street Journal, there was this interview, and it was named The Report That Shook Britain's Race Lobby. And I just thought, oh my God, that's so fascinating. So I after I read that interview, I learned about this amazing man, Dr. Tony Sewell, who had done something quite extraordinary. He had led a report that we'll soon learn about that completely challenged a lot of the presumptions about what was driving disparities in Britain, in the United Kingdom, in terms of racial and ethnic disparities. So we're very excited to have with us Dr. Tony Sewell, who is the former chair of the United Kingdom British Race and Ethnic Disparities Commission. Dr. Sewell, welcome to The Invisible Men.
Thank you for having me. And it's I feel honoured to be here. As we say in England, it's a great honour to be here, and I raise an English cup of tea to all of you.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you for joining us. Well, before we drop into this report, because I do think we in the United States there's a dominant narrative really focused on disparities, particularly by race, and sort of a normed explanation.
Just to kick these things off, I was born actually in that great centre of, I suppose, Black UK space, really, Brixton. It's a sort of maybe the equivalent to your Harlem in a sense. And the vast, just to give your readers some context of how the Black population in Britain is and how it sits in relation to everything else. We really came to Britain in mass numbers in the 1950s, particularly from the Caribbean, and settled. I know you've got migrants also coming from Jamaica towards you as well, and the rest of the Caribbean towards you as well. But essentially, that's where my family, my mother and father, were part of that generation that came in the 1950s, and I was essentially the first generation. We were the first generation, in a sense, en masse there, of Black youth in the country. And I think that being that, for me, I think a lot of the ideas in the report, in the end, I think sometimes where you come from does actually determine some of your ideas. And I think for me, I've never really been happy with the narrative that we were total and absolute victims, mainly because of that generation that came over in the 1950s. They were so resilient. They were so kind of imaginative and purposeful. Most of them owned their own homes by the time they were 25, 26, because they were forced to because of the circumstances they were in. And in many ways went on to produce quite a lot of wealth and, as I said, a very positive spirit, contrary to a lot of the narrative around them that says they were downtrodden and they were oppressed. Actually, I regard my parents as a bit of coming from Jamaica as on an adventure, really. They were pioneers, and they were chancers, and they came over and they had a great time, doing that. And culturally, Jamaicans, particularly Jamaicans, Trinidadians as well in their own way. So let's not get too islandish here. But they transformed the culture of Britain as well, in remarks. It wasn't just simply just coming over there, and they had an impact disproportionate to their numbers, and I think that was good. What we always had, though, was a real issue in race and racism, and it continued to be persistent, I think, particularly when I was growing up in school, and what we in the report, we never ever deny the reality of racism. And I've read you guys, I've seen your work. When never, and this is our problem we always have, we never deny the reality of this force that's there. However, we've never felt, we in the report, and myself, I've never felt it was the overwhelming thing that would determine what I was wanting to do and how I would become. And I think that that is really the spirit in which I've looked at my own life. And quickly I went to a pretty poor school, but worked quite hard. I loved literature. Ended up doing English at university, Essex University, then going on to do a PhD later on after doing teaching. Looking, funny enough, at some of these areas you're talking about that character. Well, I was looking at the plight of Black boys in England and looking at how, in fact, the subgroup, in a sense, became the kind of dominant agent that I think I love the stuff that John McWhirter talks about. This whole idea of having a kind of groupthink that you couldn't break from, and nobody wanted to talk about that. They wanted to talk about the racist teacher in front of you, who wasn't racist really, but there was and also this stuff around our fictive cultures, that means that you can't break and say something in case you betray. You're considered a Judas if you betray that set format that is for you, and a pretty closed one it became as well, and very hard for people to break through. And I think in the end, some of us have ended up with I hate to say it, the only thing I can think of quite quickly is some kind of Stockholm syndrome, where we kind of just can't leave it, leave that pipe. We keep coming back to it. And and almost when the laws and when we got rid of all the kind of legal impediments to stop us from moving forward. And in England, the biggest one was around the police. And it still is an issue that we still almost couldn't. And I think Shelby still talks about learning how to be free, just learning how to be free, just to run through that open door. We can't, we're kind of frozen. And I think that there's a lot of parallels, I think, with the US and the UK experience. And so coming to the report, I mean, there is a direct link to what happened, because after the George Floyd killing, everybody all around the world, apart from I think Jamaica, which they decided they weren't gonna riot because they had enough killing going on in their town to say that, look, you brothers in America, you deal with your stuff. We got a lot on our plate here, And so about 4 people decided to protest in Kingston. But apart from that, they had their own, which is really interesting take on the whole thing,
Sure.
I mean, your murder in that one day or a few days or whatever that was, that homicide would be a great day in Kingston, in terms of given that they had that. But that's another story. But in terms of the UK, we felt a close affinity to that. And people emotionally, because of what went around the world, responded to that in a way that it meant that they felt it was time now to come out with all their kind of, I suppose, issues. There was protests, but I wasn't sure what a generation, which would be my daughter's generation, around 28, I don't think they actually knew what they were protesting about outside of what was in America, the injustice there. Mm-hmm. Nobody, and also, unlike my era in 1981, which was working class poor kids, these were people who were at, and similar I could see in America, who were already at university, already on campuses, fairly middle class, and yet, it felt like the 1960s again, but it looked like they were just doing a glamour thing. So out came their Malcolm X and their Angela Davis kind of expression. And they ran that for a while. And then you've got, as you had, all the companies getting guilty, blacking their screens and doing all this thing. And suddenly everybody
And,
became
those
black
things,
for a couple of weeks.
and those things made huge differences in the lives of Black people. When you put the square in Black square, boy, that really changed things.
Yeah, and then you had this massive outpouring of white guilt, which was just kind of really strange. It was kind of people suddenly, and then suddenly we had suddenly there was just everything. There were lots of more Black people on adverts. Everybody was saying everything, and then it quickly ended, because business as usual became when we had other things to turn to. But so the government itself felt that it had to respond to this in a way. So it decided to form a race commission, but it was smart. What it didn't do was it didn't look at, let's find out what's wrong specifically with a group. What it did, it looked at it looked at racial and ethnic disparities. And I think that's the key to the whole thing. And that was great. And they chose me to chair it. And then they were on the commission, everybody else was from an Asian or Black minority backgrounds, apart from one person. But the first time in Britain, we had, funny enough, a commission about race, a significant one, I think, that was headed by Black people and headed by Black and Asian people. And so in that sense, it was kind of our report in those terms. The remit was interesting. It was to look at the disparities in Britain and come up with some solutions as to how to close them. Now, what we found, this is the kind of, we can do discussion here. The two things we found that was key was Thomas Sewell's great statement that the disparities existed, but few of them actually landed in racism. I mean, and for us, and what we did, we just followed the data. We didn't do anything else. We were cold and objective, and just watch the data and see how it played. I'll give you a couple of examples in England, how in fact this whole thing, or Britain, how it all works out in terms of explaining where those disparities come. If, for example, there was one disparity that always interested me, and that was the one of unemployment of Black young men in Britain. Now, it is, when you look at the numbers, they are disproportionately unemployed compared to white young men. However, when we looked at the data, what were the reasons behind that? All the liberal press came out and said, it's racism, it's institutional racism, why that's the case. When we looked in, it had little to do with that. We found that a disproportionate amount of young Black men were going to what we call our second tier universities, not our top ones, our very, very low second tier ones, and doing things like business studies and things like that, and then dropping out in year two. And they're just not going. And then that few of them were doing apprenticeships. Few of them were doing skill-based courses. A lot of it was to do actually with their parents saying to them, I don't want you to go on a building site. They didn't understand what really the culture was on these sites. And in fact, they were high-tech sites. It was no longer places where you get dirty and all of that. You need science, you need STEM skills to get on there. So what was actually happening, I think that Sewell says this as well, is that it's a skills issue. They just didn't have the skills for the market. And the white group were going less into those second tier universities, and more of them were going into apprenticeships and getting the skills. Mm-hmm. So we came up with a recommendation, not take all these people onto unconscious bias training courses to solve that problem, solve the skills problem. Yeah, just get down to the really where it matters. And so and that's just an example, and I'll wrap up here, of what went on. We looked at basically 4 areas, really, because we couldn't look at everything. We looked at education, we looked at employment, we looked at crime and policing and health. And let me give you one more data, that this is really what annoyed a lot of the liberals. When we looked at the health data, everybody would tell you, Black people, racism is a sickness, it makes you ill. When we looked at the data, the group that had the highest mortality rate in the country and and more kind of illnesses around, like, for example, cancers, was a white group. Yeah, the white low-income group. Black and Asian people actually had better health outcomes. In other words, in the UK today, Black people live longer and have less diseases, chronic diseases, than the white population do. Wow. You know, we don't hear about that data. You know, and so we're living in England every single week. There's something that says we're down in the dungeon. We're down right down in the sort of heaps of a slough of despond. And what really is happening is that when you look at the data, it tells you something else. Another piece of data, which I know you will see in America as well, that the population that is doing well in the country is the immigrant population. Yeah. And in London, that is the immigrant. In terms of all of our schooling outcomes right through to the university levels in terms of scoring. I mean, right into university entry, right from down to, I would say, in high school, the Black and ethnic minority groups, Black and Asian groups, outstrip the white group in terms of outcomes. And so we have a situation now where London now has some of the best results in the country at the moment. I don't know if you've ever heard, you might have seen this in some of your programs, this famous school called Eton. Have you heard of that school? It's where Boris Johnson went. It's for a famous private school. Now, that school, you know, used to kind of educate most of Britain's prime ministers. It's still regarded as the elite space. We have a school run by a Nigerian head teacher that sends more children to Oxford and Cambridge than that particular private school. Yeah. So we are completely different. So when I came out and I said, well, look, wait a minute, the whole situation now in Britain compared to when I was young, going to school, it is not stacked up against Black and Asian people. The card is not stacked up against you. That's what we said. However, there are disparities and racism does exist. We're not denying that, but the cards are not institutionally stacked up against you. Yeah. And that's really what caused the furore.
Yeah, the fact that you had the courage to say that. I mean, that was a landmine. By the way, we'll have to compare notes. My parents emigrated from Nique, West Indies to England in the mid-1950s and then ultimately came to the United States. Oh, wow. And my dad will always say, when he was in Jamaica, he was a man. It wasn't until he came to the United States that he realized he was a Black man. Yeah. Because there was so much of this obsession with race. And it's interesting because, you know, one of the there were many findings in your report as you're starting to outline, and I can't wait to get to the reaction. But one of the things that was in the report, it said, in many areas of investigation, including educational failure and crime, we were led upstream to family breakdown as one of the main reasons for poor outcomes. Family is also the foundation stone of success for many ethnic minorities. So how did that play out? Because that's a sizable statement, right? You were basically saying, oh, sure, racism exists, but it's not the only force. And here's something, can we shine the spotlight in a different way?
You know, it's quite interesting. We really thought in England that would really be the one that people would get more kind of angst about. But what actually happened, we qualified it a lot because we did recognize, and I think this is why it was interesting, because I knew that you could just easily go in there. We did say that we're not going to sort of prejudice, because in the end, that statement always lands up at the doorstep of the single mother. You know what I mean? It comes around. And we went quickly in there and said, we're not here to make the single mother a villain. However, we do recognize that the family is the key element. And I think just putting that sentence in, I think that kind of almost, we kind of stopped some of the barrage of criticism. But let me tell you, where it probably did where it probably does work in a sense was that people then interpreted that as meaning that we were denying racism. See what I mean? By talking about the family and these other things, you guys are still in denial of this thing that's there. That unless you fix white people and their institutions, you guys are going nowhere. And that's really the thing. So all your other stuff we'll take, but it's not really the real deal. You know, unless you guys come in and say,
yep,
it's whiteness and all that other stuff, then, you know, you're going nowhere.
Tony, so interesting. As I looked at some of the findings in your report, one of the things that I really wanted to hear from you about, and I'm sure our audience would love to be educated, is the findings as it relates to Caribbean Blacks versus African-born Blacks in the UK, and some of the differences you saw there.
Yeah, I mean, that leads on to the family. Now, let me give you some numbers. I mean, what we found was that in the schools, now, this is another thing that about my group, the Caribbean group, meaning the reality that we've got to face. We are only 1.1% of the population, and we've stayed that for the last 10, 15 years. That 1.1 hasn't moved. Every other group, every other ethnic group has increased. Yeah, the biggest group into ethnic group. If you think of non-white ethnic group, is the Pakistani group. They're the biggest in terms of size. And what that shows is that, you know, the African group have come along later, yeah, in the game, really, in terms of numbers. And they've increased. So they're the biggest Black group in the population. So I bring you those numbers because it does tell a tale of a different kind of Black situation in Britain, where, in fact, without being, I mean, you know, the reality is that given a few years' time, I think that Caribbean group will be so small because also it's integrated into the mixed group as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it'll be so small, but we have such a loud voice, you know, much louder than its population. And so what you want to look at then is what drives that, particularly that West African group, to be so successful. Yes. They score better GCSE, equivalent would be our high school results at the end of high school. They get the better scores, better advanced level scores as well, and better university entrance. They also get less, I'm trying to think of the word. We call it, your term, when you're thrown out of school for bad behavior. We call it exclusion. Yeah? Yeah, they score a lot less than the Caribbean boy. And I said in the report, and they didn't like it, that look, the Caribbean boy and the African boy sit in the same classroom, and yet the African boy is less likely to be thrown out of school than the white boy or the African Caribbean boy. So you cannot blame racism. They're in the same classrooms. What is the reason for that boy not only less likely to be punished for poor behavior, looks in visual terms looks the same. So what is it about him, and also what is it about him and her that makes them also have the better results? We came down to the family, because when we looked at it, and this is a statistic that you may recognize amongst African Americans, I don't know, we have 60.5%, maybe a bit higher now, of single parents are in the Caribbean group. Yeah, 60 odd percent single parents. In the African group, it's around about 35, 40%. Yeah. And it's the highest, that Caribbean group is the highest in the whole of the country proportionally. So you have to, without putting the single mother as the villain, you have to talk about family and family disruption, because that really is one of the issues. And we have recommendations around that.
And why do you think it's so difficult for people to acknowledge what seems to be so self-evident? The data is overwhelming. Why is it so difficult to say that you can acknowledge that racism exists, but factors like stability of the family, marriage, two-parent households are a far more determinative factor on kids' outcomes.
We have, I mean, I must admit, in Britain we did have, I don't know if you had it in the US, but there was a time where I think some of our governments went after the single mothers with a vengeance that was unnecessary. I think that's part of it, not the whole explanation. And I think it was just used politically, ideologically, as a way of beating up people. And I do think that legacy has fed into some of this and has allowed the left, in a sense, to build a narrative that says you're blaming the victim. Yeah, and people can refer to all of that. And some people on the right as well are nervous about speaking up because they were part of that kind of movement against the single mother. So I do think there is that going on. And I do think the other piece in it is just simply, there's a politics around the fact that the family itself is so nuanced that you dare not talk about any kind of nuclear family at all, because politically everything is up for how you want to imagine it to be. So, that isn't on the agenda anymore. So, those two forces, I think, are there. But I do think the overarching thing for the Black situation is that it comes back to agency. It comes back to the part of it that says, look, you guys don't have to really worry about your lifestyle or how you are, or fathers don't have to have any responsibility for their children because the state will take care of that.
Yeah. I was taken by, I'll read another section that deals with agency. It says, your commission was taken, as you interviewed people from all around the country, you were taken by the distinctions being drawn between causes that were external to the individual and those that could be influenced by the actions of the individuals himself or herself. As our investigations proceeded, we increasingly felt that an unexplored approach to closing disparity gaps was to examine the extent to which individuals and their communities could help themselves through their own agency rather than wait for invisible external forces to assemble to do the job.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lovely sentence. And I think really what let me give you an example of a group that, to me, people say, oh, they've got sort of inbuilt privileges, but I don't believe that. That is the Indian group in Britain. 40% of our physicians, they don't represent that population, they are the physicians in the UK.
Wow.
40%.
Wow.
Now, all right, you might say that not every person from that background should be a doctor, or be in the medical profession. But what's driving that is the family. There's a sense of an agency around that drives that forward. And so you've got, instead of just looking down on them, to say, well, that's actually to be celebrated. That's a good disparity in some ways. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that was interesting was when you then began to look at so for example, there was a reason why, and this is where the cultural things come into play. The managers in our National Health Service tend to be predominantly white. The healthcare managers, 95% of them are white. And so we had these union people from, come in and say, there you are, there is institutional racism. But then when we spoke to the physicians who might have wanted to transfer and become managers, lots of them didn't want to do it. There wasn't the desire there to do it. It's not that there was an impediment. One of the reasons, and this was never in the report, but I'll declare it now since I'm now fired and I can say what I want now, was that there was a whole racket going on in the private medicine area. So as you know, you could be paid by the state to do your medical practice and then use the same facilities and hustle and do your own private thing in the same context. Many of those doctors didn't want to go and be a boring pen pushing manager all day. I mean, the salaries weren't bad, but why would you want to go over there when you could be happy over here? So what I'm trying to get at here is that these expressions of declarations of institutional racism, you need to push through, and you find another kind of complexity there that's waiting on you to say, "Oh, I see now," And yet there are lobby groups who will say that the health service itself is institutionally racist because there are no Asian managers.
Tony, I wanted to run something by you. So a view that I've kind of always had globally, that countries that ended the transatlantic slavery system earlier would progress faster in the modern day in terms of, managing through race as a point of conflict. So, I look at Brazil versus the U.S. Brazil, I think, was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to end slavery.
That comes to mind, yeah.
And there, I'd argue that the quote unquote African people in Brazil are probably living in the 1950s from a U.S. perspective. But then, of course, the UK, you were critical to ending transatlantic slavery. It was those white men that decided it was no longer appropriate. And you, as a country, ended it 40 years before the U.S. did.
Yeah.
But it seems like, and I'm a little bit long-winded here, but it seems like maybe the civil rights movement of the U.S., Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and what happened there, it accelerated our progress past you. But I want to get your perspective, UK versus U.S., sort of 21st century society.
It's an interesting one, because let me just tell you one thing, that the United States, black people in the United States, and I'll make a big generalization. I don't think that you guys realize, well, you two do, but a lot of them do not realize that how much you are American, rather than black, because you represent America. You see, there's a sort of, I can't understand this. There's some of my friends, and they just keep going on about race and America is this. But you were the standard of America. When we think of, from an English point of view and from a European point of view, who plays the music? Who runs? All right, okay, you could go into other, not just music, not the usual stereotypes, but the representation of the country, the essence of what it is you, and so you are on first base. Yet, when I go there, sometimes I feel that too many African Americans don't realize that. They don't realize that they're in the front row. And for us, we looked at you guys as heroes. People said, "Wow!" I remember when we used to. This is before, and I have to mention, before the Jamaicans began to whip all of you. When the athletics used to come along, and there were black Brits, and we used to stand in the blocks for the running. And we used to kind of just start backing the Americans, because our guys used to come in there, and it's like they didn't even belong in there. They were just sitting there, and they were kind of, And then our anthem came up, and nobody wanted to listen to that. And then your anthem came up, and we said, "Whoa!" And so off you won, and you ran it, and you won, and then you had Muhammad Ali, and you had all these other people, and then and then I go over there, and everyone's sulking. So I thought that's the piece. We used you, whatever was going on back in your heads, we were using you guys as inspiration for us.
Yep. And
I do think that has helped. Also, we actually had some advantages. And this is where I think in Britain, I don't know if you noticed how many black British actors have come over to America to act in your films. Yeah, Idris Elba, Naomi Harris.
Absolutely.
And let me tell you why that has happened. It's because living in Britain, you hinted at it, gives you a particular perspective. We've got a little bit more advantages there, and we're beginning to realize it, because we've got the Caribbean, we've got America, we've got Africa. And we've got it locked in our little island, in our space, yeah? Mm. And so what we're able to do is then go out to get this global perspective. For a long time, African Americans didn't have passports. Many of you didn't travel anywhere. you know. And so what we've been able to do is use for example, I remember Spike Lee saying that the reason why he likes to cast Black Brits is that they had a classical training in drama, in the drama schools, whereas, the others were just built, but they kind of were trained on TV movies. What happened was we used that kind of background to come in and then take the work away from you, and happily so.
You may not know a comedy group or team called Key and Peele, but they've done a whole series of sketches about British blacks coming in and playing, hoodlums and gangsters. It's a very funny skit, because when it's cut from the scene, they go back into their British mannerisms.
The other thing is, I remember Denzel Washington coming over here in a film and trying to do a South London accent and really collapsing.
I've seen that film, yes.
Yeah, it was terrible. But yeah, we can come over there and we can get your accent, we can get it. I can't get it.
Wow. So Tony, you just shared with us this big news that you did the report. It had a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the government is now finally taking, there were about 25 recommendations.
Yeah, there's 25 recommendations. I'm just trying to see if I can see the kind of report to show you. It's something called Inclusive Britain. That's what they've called it now. So they've come out with 70 action points in a document called Inclusive Britain. And, they've taken everything. And so, I stole some of the stuff from you. For example, there was one which was an Office for Health Disparities, which I think you have in America. Well, we've got one now. We've got our Brit one now. I just stole that. And I said, right, we're going to have something in England because we have issues that are very specific to groups around getting more Black people involved in clinical trials, because you're developing a medicine and then Black people don't turn up for the trial. They're not engaged in the trial. So most of the COVID, although those vaccines, most of them were tried in Britain anyway, were not tried on Black and Asian people. It was white population that it was worked on. So we've got to have a mixture there. So there's all those things that we wanted to have in there, and they've got. Our biggest one, our most controversial one, which I thought they would block, was around what we call Class B drugs. We would just say marijuana. In Jamaica, we would say the possession of ganja. Now, a lot of Black kids get put into the criminal justice system because their area is more policed. And so the police are not really going after the drugs, they're going after knives or other criminals. But on the way, they pick up the young kids with possession of marijuana. So what we said was, wait a minute, instead of putting them in the criminal justice system, the option is to go for a public health route with them. But they have to admit guilt. So there has to be an agency in there. They have to admit they're guilty, and then they're pushed towards that. So, but between you and me, this is almost the beginnings of not the legalization, but certainly the loosening of that law. And so, that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But it was the police themselves that begged us to do that. Because
what do you think about that? Does that open the door to giving more permission for that kind of behavior? What do you?
It's a very hard one, but let me tell you, it's important because I think, given the high proportion of Black kids in the criminal justice system itself, I think it gives that diversion route will give agencies a better chance, and the family as well, to really engage those young men before they go off and do something worse. So I actually think, for me, the rationale with that one was that we really wanted them to have an opportunity, in a sense, to go into something different, be diverse. One of the things that you see what you do in those agencies. Now, I think that it's not the problem. I don't think the problem is the marijuana. I think the problem is groupthink. a lot of those kids really don't. I mean, they're in there because their friends are in there. Now, the police are worried that some of those are selling drugs, and you're giving them an easy route. But it's not that. It's the first base route, so first offence. We would rather you do. I think the other compelling kind of thing was around fairness. If, for example, you are at Oxford University and you're smoking a weed, whatever, the chances of you being caught by the police are zero, because police don't really come near you, you know. And you could say, well, that's tough. You just have to obey the law. But we're not saying that it's illegal. We're just saying that the initial punishment should be this. And we'll see how it goes. I'm hoping that it will change, you know, because I think that there is an issue there. And the police would like to be, their time is taken up with what they would regard as a minor offence, and they can't go, they get wrapped up in it. There's not enough time going after the bigger fish in terms of resources. So that's really one of the practical reasons. Another one, which is, I think, a key recommendation for us, is to do with the way in which we look at the family. And what we want to do is produce better support agencies for families, and actually try and see if, for example, there's a better way of, and we call them family hubs. I looked at the figures. Black people do not engage a lot in therapy, family therapy. You know, it's kind of, that's a middle class thing, you know, you do. So we want to really kind of bring in those kinds of discussions where at a younger age, I mean, even in my own family, I could see, I mean, it may or may not work, but I think if we were almost kind of encouraged strongly to use those tools to keep the family together, particularly the children. And also, part of the issue is when the mum and dad break up, or if they're at all, the child is the one that really does suffer in this. And so we need to bring those agents together and see if they can come up with a system where the child is protected. And so I think those kinds of things we thought were important for that. So the family was key, and making it work was key for us.
Ian, should we move to our speed round?
Yeah, yes, but I have one more question. I don't want to jump over the fact that the bravery and courage that Dr. Sewell had to really exhibit over this period of time. So I just want to give you a moment. What was the personal backlash that you had to endure by saying these things, even though you were part of a commission?
One of the visual ones, which I thought was a very strange one, was that somebody put up on their Twitter page a mixed heritage MP of us, all the commissioners, in riding on horses with a Ku Klux Klan thing over their head, and saying that these are the new commissioners coming into town. You know, I mean, the guy is sick. I mean, that's what I can say, because the first recommendation we put out is that our race watchdog standard gets more money and is better resourced to, you know, so that it can really fight racism, you know, in a better and racial complaints. We have an online kind of a recommendation around anybody now, companies, the companies, we're going to go after the Googles and the Apples and all the other companies, Amazon, if in fact they're entertaining online racial abuse. I mean, so where did he get the idea that we were these? So that was the kind of things we were getting, and the Twitter space was the thing that was the worst, you know.
And where did you get the strength and fortitude and support?
All right, let me tell you, I don't believe in this strength, fortitude thing when that stuff comes along, because you have to get on with a job. So I tend to go to that story in Odysseus, where he's hearing the sirens, and he gets the wax and he puts it in his ears, and then he just carries on because obviously the sirens would turn him into something nasty. So what I did was I don't have a Twitter account. I don't have Facebook. So honestly, I don't know what's going on. My daughter occasionally tells me things, but I don't know. I didn't know what was being said because I just plugged up.
Yeah,
and I think that's a very good way, useful way of dealing with it.
Yep.
I must admit, it has impacted my. I had a conversation with my brother who doesn't fully get it, and I felt that he was telling me, "What's going on? Your report." He said everybody's against it. What's happening? So that did hurt me a bit because I felt that he didn't fully understand. That you now see the impact of our work, particularly now that the government have taken it on. But I think at the time, because all you would do was open up or Google and find us under attack and my name attached to it.
Yeah.
And I think he was definitely felt hurt by that. Mm. And I think even to this day, I'm not sure if he fully understands what we've done, actually. I think, I think, and that I think of all the things has been really hard.
Yeah. I get it. All right, Nique. Yeah, let's do it.
Very good. Well, Brother Tony, we have a segment of the show that we call the speed round, where I'll offer up a couple of individuals or philosophies, ask you to pick one and tell us why. So we've got to start very locally. Frank Bruno or Lennox Lewis?
Oh God! I'm going to have one or the other.
One or the other.
I mean, everybody went for Lennox. And I've got to go for Lennox in a way, and I don't mean it because Frank is, considered. I remember the fight between Lennox and Frank in England, and it was pitted as. And there were some racial things going on in there. It was pitted as Frank being the kind of, a little bit like somebody who was so conformist and so kind of, but it wasn't only that. I think Frank, we know now, had mental health problems as well. I do think he had some of that. And I'm not absolutely sure how great a boxer he was anyway. If you're just looking at the levels of boxing. So forget the lifestyles of both of them. And Lennox was this flamboyant, kind of cool kind of guy. And so people went for him. But I kind of like Lennox. He did sort of come out as a boxer philosopher. He tried some of that stuff, I don't know how much he read, but he was, at least you could have a conversation with him about, he might have heard of Plato. I don't know if Frank. So it's kind of like that. You could have had a better conversation with Lennox, I think. But outside of that, not for the reasons other people dislike Frank, but I just thought that Lennox for the conversation.
Very good. Now we'll bring it back to America. Malcolm X or Martin Luther King?
Oh, it always has to be Martin Luther King for me, because I think he articulated better this notion about humanity. Malcolm did get there in his own way, but I just felt that, more and more, I kind of think Martin Luther King was so radical, because, and it's this thing about what I said to you about particularly African Americans, but even in Britain, once you realize that you're more than this race, in this race burden that we're on, then you can, it gives you an energy that is tremendous. And I think that's what, when Martin Luther King was going, what people have missed is they think, oh, he's a little bit soft. And I've heard people say, oh, well, he's the compromiser. He actually is the radical in the room, really. And also his smartness in seeing that race really is a bit of a diversion, because some of the real issues really are around class, around these other factors that are driving the thing forward. And your better returns actually is when you make the change in the mainstream for everybody. All boats rise, that sort of thing about the rising tide. So no, King by King is definitely the one for me.
But we'll wrap it with one more, which is a little bit silly, but hopefully you'll have fun with it. The Honorable Marcus Garvey or Winston Churchill?
Oh, look. Now, Garvey's interesting because I'm a Garvey scholar. And I would say Garvey because I know more about Garvey. And I just don't say, not because he's black, but Garvey in a sense that he, I think people miss the piece in it. It's not the nationalism and the stuff like that. It's actually the money making. He's actually after making the change. And this is what people don't understand really, is that he was saying quite simply two things. He was saying success and success. Everything's about success. Drive that and you get there. And also capitalism has its faults, but in a way, that's the way and the Booker T. Washington thing and the whole thing about self-help and all of that thing is good. Where he collapsed, where he gets kind of strange is his perception of Africa as basically being just a little European empire in the end that he just plunges a flag on. It doesn't really understand fully the nuances of Africa itself. It becomes almost like a symbol rather than a real place. And I think for him, that was, I think, where it's problematic around some of the nationalism. I don't think that actually is relevant now. I think is a different kind of conversation we need. But certainly, go out and make some money. Yeah, Marcus Garvey.
Very good. I'll close. I know we didn't spend a lot of time on this session talking about your research and understanding and what you've articulated around what is a British education. But I've reviewed some of your lectures around that. And I'll tell you the one thing that hit me, going back to Mr. Garvey, is I sort of recognized that Mr. Garvey's education in Jamaica was likely a British education that also was the foundation for him.
You hit the nail on the head. This idea that you throw away everything out of your past. I mean, he comes there and look how he dresses. He comes up there with his ties. Garvey has very little cultural thing going on about Africa. He's really a colonial, really, in a sense. And in the end, it doesn't surprise me that he ends up in Britain. He ends up in London and dies. Yes. Because and people don't like that. People think, oh, you're kind of being offensive. But it's not. It's that, in fact, what happened to us in the Caribbean, in a sense, was, and this is the bit that people didn't understand, I wrote in my foreword, was that we became African and European together. It was a mix-up. We had all those influences on us. And what we did, we were involved, no matter how we like it or not. We used our imagination as a survival tactic to mix those two things together. So the African memory is in there, and we also had what we were given from the Brits, and that's what makes a Caribbean person. It's a mixture. Rex Nettleford has a beautiful saying. He talks. I think it's a bit stereotypical. He talks about African rhythm, European melody, and it's that kind of thing that makes it kind of happen for us as a people. So in that sense, and I think to a certain extent, African Americans have some of that as well going on in terms of who they are. We're not fully African and we're not fully European. We're both, and that's what makes us rich, and that's what the culture is. The idea that you then say, I'm going to destroy everything. I remember Malcolm X saying, I'm going to wipe out every white thing in him, especially being a mixed person himself. I found it really strange, No, I'm going to take the best of the British, I'm going to take the best of the European, and I'm going to take the best of the African memory, and that's going to run me. And that's really what we are.
Superb. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Sewell, I just think the courage, the bravery, the leadership you showed in Britain, my hope is that many of us can bring those lessons learned to, populations in the United States. We're in the midst of all of these same arguments, and the narratives that you really help to debunk are very vibrant here. And so it's really been a great pleasure to have you on. And
Thanks.
as you know, when Nique and I created this entire enterprise called the Invisible Men, ultimately we wanted to talk to young people. In particular, we created this character, Darryl, 16-year-old Black kid who could be from Brixton, who's hearing all of this stuff, that these economic disparities, the reason that you're unemployed, it's because of systemic racism. And it almost robs from Darryl this belief, the ability that he can actually control his own destiny.
That's right.
So after doing what you did, speaking to hundreds, if not thousands of people across the UK, what advice would you give to someone like Darryl, who's 16, who's trying to make his way in the world and is confused by all these narratives?
You know what? Sometimes you have to do what I did with the report and read Odysseus and put those earplugs in your ear. Because it's the noise. It's the noise. Often it's the noise. And unfortunately, that Twitter, that whole internet thing that we've got, that social media, is one where the groupthink comes in and it just comes at you all the time, And so you've got to really be able to, cut away from that in a way that is going to make you work. So I often, if it's possible, if Darryl goes to where you're not meant to go, often, I remember one time I went to see in London. I love Bach, yeah. And I went to a Bach concert in London Festival Hall. And next, there's a group called OCBisa, which is an African group. And they were playing on one side of the hall, something down the road. And there was a Bach concert down the other. When I arrived at the Bach concert, the guy at the door said, no, you're over there. You're over there. I said, no, my ticket says Bach. It doesn't say OCBisa. Now let me in. And it's like you have to kind of break away from the groupthink and do your own thing. You know what I mean? And that's the advice I give. Yeah.
100%. Man, 100%. Independent, critical thinking. Think for yourself, and don't let anybody push their ideas on you where you fundamentally disagree.
Yeah.
So important. Well, Dr. Tony Sewell, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
It's amazing what you've done in the UK. I could only hope that we could produce a similar kind of report and then have the government actually take action to follow the recommendations. So thank you very much. And thank you to all of our listeners. This has been another episode of The Invisible Men. Like you, always a pleasure.
Same, Ian. And to the doctor, thank you. A real pleasure to connect with you directly. And just to reinforce Ian's point, your scholarship and effort has global impact. So thank you.
Thank you.
If you'd like to see all of the episodes of The Invisible Men, just go to www.invisible.men. And thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching another episode of The Invisible Men. You can find other episodes at the AEI podcast channel on YouTube or the website invisible.men or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.